Last week I was sharing an illustration with you about when I was helping someone learn how to drive. I was giving them instructions and we were driving down the road and I was explaining that there was a police car on the side of the road that had one stopped. And as we're going down this two-lane road, we come closer to it, and as we're getting closer, I said, go ahead and move over to the left. And then we got a little bit closer. It was, go ahead and move over a little bit more. And then finally it was like, move over. And then finally I grabbed the wheel and moved them to the other side of the road and back. And I was talking about how, I got past it and I was like, when I asked you to move over, what were you thinking? And they're like, my teacher told me never cross the yellow line. And, as you're thinking about it, you're thinking through the eyes of somebody that's been driving for a while, and a policeman's on the side of the road. You want to give them plenty of room, so of course you pull over, you give them room. But for a new driver, that the teacher has drilled in their mind over and over again, do not cross the yellow line, especially a double yellow line. Never cross a double yellow line. But then when you get to that situation, it's like, which one do I listen to? This guy sitting beside me or the teacher that's been telling me don't cross the double yellow line? Well, obviously there's the letter of the law and then there's the spirit of the law. The letter of the law is don't cross the double center line because cars coming at you will hit you. And that's not a good thing. And we can reason through that and say, yeah, that's right. But if there's an officer on the side of the road and there's no one coming towards me, then, the letter of the law gives way to the spirit of the law. I want to give that police officer all the room I can as I go by him. So that makes sense to us. But what about spiritually? What about spiritually? How often do we look at God's Word and we battle in our mind the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law? As you become a Christian and as you walk down a new path and learning new things, it's a lot like that driver. You're trying to reason the letter of the law with the spirit of the law. And you're trying to figure it out. What is it that God really wants? Well, as we read, if you have your bulletin with you, or if you'd like to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, I want to read this to you because it kind of sets the stage a little bit. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verses 5 through 11. Now that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competence comes from God. He has made us competent as ministers of the new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Now if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of his glory, transitory though it was. Will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that brought condemnation was glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison to the surpassing glory. And if what was transitory came with glory, how much greater is the glory that which lasts? Whew. So, when we look at the Old Testament and the Old Law, there were a lot of laws about how to do sacrifices, how to and not to touch things that are unclean, or if you do, what to do about it, and all of these laws and regulations. Somebody had said one time that there was over 400 laws in the Old Covenant. That's not including all of those that were added on top of because of, like the Pharisees, for instance, would say, if you are walking more than so far on the Sabbath, you're breaking the law. Or if you had a twig caught on your garment, you're actually breaking the law because you're laboring on the Sabbath day. So there were a lot of laws that were added on top of it. But over 400 laws that were in the actual law, but over, I think it was something like over 6,000 laws if you included all the rest of them. But anyway, regardless of that, the idea is that under the old law, there were a lot of regulations, a lot of things that you had to follow. And nobody could do it perfectly. So when we look at the old law and we see that, that nobody could do it perfectly, then there's this feeling of it brings condemnation. Because if I can't do it perfectly, but I have to do it perfectly, where's the give? Sorry, my throat got dry. Well, the give is that although they could not do it perfectly, Christ came and did do it perfectly. And when he did it perfectly, he paid the price. He chose to carry perfect sacrifice on that cross. And in doing so, brought forgiveness. So the old covenant is replaced by the new covenant, which is brought in by Jesus Christ. We don't have confidence or competence because of our own abilities, but simply because of God and his love for us. In James chapter 2, again in your bulletin there if you'd like to follow along, James chapter 2 starting with verse 8. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin and are convicted by the law as lawbreakers. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. For he who said, you shall not commit adultery, also said, you shall not murder. If you do not commit adultery, but you do commit murder, you have become a lawbreaker. Speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. Because judgment without mercy will be shown by anyone who has not been merciful. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Basically what he's saying there is that if you break even one part of the law, somebody described it as this: if you had a long chain and all of the chain links were perfectly good except for one that you break, that chain is no longer able to be complete. It's now broken. That's sin. Any part of the law that we break makes us unable to claim God's righteousness in and of ourselves. But the beauty of it is that Jesus becomes that missing link. He replaces us, our failures, with his righteousness, and again restores that chain. Our desire is to be righteous. Our want is to be perfect. None of us can be. We all fail. We all fall short of the glory of God. So what's our hope? Our hope is in Jesus Christ. So back to the idea of being the letter of the law or the spirit of the law. Jesus gives us an example of this. We were reading from Matthew chapter 5 last week. The blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit, who mourn, the meek, the thirsty for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, and the persecuted. Blessed are all of those people. If you think about those people are not the people that we would normally look to as our example. Blessed are those. Blessed are poor. Why would we say that? Blessed are meek. Why would we want that? But in Jesus' eyes, he flips everything upside down. He turns the world upside down and says, the meek, they'll inherit the earth. He says, the poor in spirit, what does it say? The poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Each time he takes those who we would not put up on a good standing, and he says, they're the ones that inherit. They're the best. But how? How can that be? It's because of God's grace and his mercy. That's how we get there. So that's what he starts off with in chapter 5 and verse 13. He says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything, except to be thrown out and trampled by the men. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Gives two examples there, the salt and the light. The salt, he says, if it loses its saltiness, it's worthless. It has no value at all. It can't help. And you ever season something and you taste it and it's just not quite enough, so you season it a little bit more, and you keep tasting, pretty soon it's like, man, just pour the whole thing in there. It won't do any good. You know? That's kind of the salt loses its saltiness. It has no value if it doesn't have a saltiness to it. And as believers, as followers of Christ, he's challenging us. Don't allow your testimony to become worthless. Because if you say one thing and live another way, then you're not being that example for Christ. Same thing with a lamp. You put a lamp on a lampstand so that you can see it throughout the house. Now this goes back in time. We don't have this situation anymore. But if you want to know what it's like, go watch an old movie and you'll probably get the idea. The idea is that they have very little lighting. Inside you would bring a candle, and a candle would light up the whole room. But if you put it underneath a bowl, it's worthless. It has no value. It doesn't light the room for anyone. But if we put a light on a lampstand so that it lights up the whole room, then it has a benefit to everyone. And that's us as believers, as followers of Christ. If you want your example to be worth something, put it up on a lampstand. Let it shine. Problem is what happens when we're not perfect? We put our light up on the lampstand and then we fail. We make mistakes. How could that bring glory and honor to God? It says that God's love is made perfect in our weakness. In other words, because we are imperfect, God's love shows us his perfection. Because he gives us grace and mercy and makes us perfect. Not that we don't make mistakes. Because you can look around the room, and if nowhere else, look right up here, and you'll see somebody that makes lots of mistakes. I make lots of mistakes, but yet I can let my light shine. And I can freely admit that I make mistakes. I'm not perfect. I can still be a light for God, even with my failures. So he talks about the salt and the light. But then he goes on in verse 17, and he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter or the least stroke of pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Wow, that's kind of confusing. He's saying, Jesus himself, I have come to fulfill the law, not to abolish it, to fulfill it. And he says, in doing so, I'm bringing to light some things. I'm showing you that you can't do it on your own, that you're not good enough, you're not righteous enough, you're not holy enough, but I'm going to help you get there. And he's saying that unless you are more perfect than the Pharisees and those law keepers, which we talked about last week, Paul, being the greatest of all sinners, he calls himself, was once a keeper of the law. So much so that he believed that these Christians that were around were false prophets, and he began to kill them. And his idea of keeping righteousness. Now, you can see how that could easily be contrary to God's law. He's actually killing people for the purposes for God. And of course that wasn't God's desire. But he was trying to keep the law so faithfully. And yet, he said that Jesus tells us that by trying to do that, he actually breaks the law. Look in verse 21. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin, but anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar first and go and be reconciled to your brother. Then come offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and he may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. The letter of the law said, do not murder. Jesus says, but I tell you, don't even hate. Those that do wrong to you, do good to them. Those who are taking you to court, make it right before you get there. Help them to come to some kind of conclusion before you go before the judge. What's his point in all of that? His point is that the letter of the law says do not murder. I'm telling you, go way beyond that. It's not the letter of the law that I'm concerned about, it's the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law says if you even hate your brother, you've already sinned against him. His desire, God's desire, what Jesus brought in his teaching was that he is fulfilling the law by this new covenant. The new covenant being that I love you, I care about you, I want what's best for you. And so in doing so, I am willing to sacrifice. I'm willing to give of my desires so that you can enjoy this life. So that's what he's given us there. He goes on in verse 27, he gives us another example. Have you heard that it was said, do not commit adultery? But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than your whole body to go into hell. I want to tell you here, he wasn't suggesting that we need to go out and poke our eye out or cut off our hand. That's not what he was suggesting. But he's given us an example. Heaven is a wonderful place to go, and something that we want to look forward to, that we want to enjoy. But if something in this world is causing us to stumble, if it's causing us to turn our back on Christ, to give up the promise of eternal life, then it's not worth it. Because whatever that is, whatever has become so important to us that we forget or deny God, that has become our God. And if we're going to follow that, there is a destination called hell that we don't want to end up in. And he's telling us, get rid of anything that hinders us. Get rid of anything that keeps us from being able to live for him, to love him first. Pretty harsh words, but yet at the same time, he's got a message of love in there. He says in the next verses, do not divorce. And he says, it has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, some pretty harsh words. But what's his point? What was going on was men would marry somebody, decided he wanted to change, and he would give her a certificate of divorce according to Moses' law. But they missed the point of Moses' law. Moses' law was not to give them a right to go out and divorce for no reason. The purpose of his law, that law and that ruling, was so that for those situations that one mate or the other just decided that they were not going to live according to God's law, that other person had the ability to submit a certificate of divorce so that they could carry on their life. It's not God's desire, it's not God's will, but at the same time, he gives us that option. And again, his idea here for us is to consider the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law, but consider the spirit of what he's saying. And he does that with oaths in the next verse. I'm not going to read that section, but he's talking about giving oaths away and saying, let your yes be yes and your no, no. Don't get sidetracked by this, I swear on this or I swear on that. Then the next section in verse 38, he says, an eye for an eye And he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Again, the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. The letter of the law on that day said that if a Roman came along and wanted you to carry his burden with you for a mile, you had to pick up his burden and carry it for a mile. He says, carry it too. And we're thinking to ourselves, man, I've already taken off time to carry it 1 mile. You want me to take it too? Why would he do that? Why would God ask us to do that? Jesus says, because I want your heart. I don't want you to just do it because it's a law. I want you to do it with a good attitude and a good heart. And he says, take it with it. Just pick it up and go. And do it with a good attitude. And I can imagine this situation that you're out working in your field and you're doing what you have to do and you need to get this done and it's almost sunset and it's time for you to quit for the day, but along comes this Roman soldier and says, hey, come carry my load. Oh man, I was almost done with this job. You know, I could have finished it, but now I'm not going to be able to finish it. And I could see how my attitude would stink pretty bad at that point. But imagine this Roman soldier telling you to come over and carry it for the next mile. And it's marked out. Everybody knows where a mile is because it's marked out. You have to carry it that far. But you get up to the mile, and instead of stopping, you keep on going. And maybe you're talking to the soldier, and you're sharing with him about Jesus. And as you walk, you pass that marker, and you keep going. And the soldier might be snickering, you know, man, he doesn't even know we passed it. He's so busy talking. You get to the second marker, and you turn around and hand him his bag back, and you say, thanks for giving me the opportunity to carry your bag. Now, what would that Roman soldier be thinking at that moment? His jaw would drop, and he would think to himself, this isn't anything I've experienced before. This is kind of cool. Now, what was he just telling me about Jesus? There's that light up on that lampstand. There's the salt that has that saltiness again. Because he's taken it from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. Once again in verse 43, you have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise and set on evil and good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And that's not talking perfection as in I don't make mistakes. That's talking about being like Christ. Being Christ-like to others. So when you greet somebody and you don't know them, to say hi to them, that's great. It's even better to say hi to the enemy that you know and to be polite to someone who is mean to you, somebody that might have a grudge against you, to be able to be polite and kind and nice to someone that you don't feel like being nice to. What difference does that make? When we have an attitude of Christ to those who hate us, those who despise what we stand for, those who have objections to the values and the standards that we have, when we love them, we are being like Christ. Because what does it say Jesus did? He died, not just for the godly, but for the unrighteous. He died for sinners. He died for us who were enemies. While we were yet enemies, he died for us. That's the love of Jesus. The list goes on. He talks about the needy and how we need to help those who are in need. He talks about praying, but not as the hypocrites do, not so that others can see you, but in secret. Pray from your heart, not so other people know, not to be showing off. And fasting the same way. And he goes through all of these different things. for us to understand this idea that we're going to change lanes. We're no longer going to be driving in this lane for a minute. We're going to go over here, and we're going to drive in the other lane, because we want people to see that there's a difference. We want to change our ways and live like Christ instead of like us. That's an example of that driving. May not go through with everything that we're talking about here, but the idea is that we see something, and instead of doing what the letter of the law says, we're going to go beyond the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. And the spirit of the law says, be like Jesus to those who we come in contact with. Love those who hate us. Do good to those who persecute you. How can we be light and salt to the world? By being like him, doing for others. I think about all of the things that we see and hear in the world today, and it's hard sometimes to be like that. This last week, yesterday we went and watched a movie. It was called The Jesus Revolution. And it was kind of fun to watch the movie because it was set back in the 60s, the things that happened years ago when I was just a child. Some of you guys were much older than I am, so you guys experienced the 60s. I just was born in the 60s. But for those of you that experienced the 60s, you'll like this movie because it goes back and it talks about the hippies and those that were different in the love and peace and all of that day and age. And but one of the things that was really amazing to me is this preacher is standing up front in front of his congregation, which he had, maybe a dozen or so people in his audience, and he's preaching, and he's telling them, one week he says, these people, they don't follow the standards, they don't follow the rules and regulations and everything, and so, we need to be careful not to associate with those kind of people, that kind of sermon. And then he's talking to his daughter, and his daughter says, if you could just experience what these people are really after. They're after the same things you are. Peace, love. Those are the same things you preach about. And he says, well, if God will bring me a hippie, I'll listen to him. So she picks up this hippie alongside the road and takes him home. And I won't ruin the whole movie for you, but the next scene is back in the church. And after he has talked to this hippie, one side of the church has a bunch of these hippies in the group, and they're without their shoes on, and they're sitting over here. And on this side is the people that have been with them, and they're kind of wearing their suits and ties and everything, and kind of a contrast between the two groups. But my favorite scene is that that one of the members challenges him and says, these guys, they're staining our carpet with their dirty feet, So the next Sunday, as they show up, he's washing the feet of every peace-loving hippie that comes through the door. And as he washes their feet and he blesses them, they come into the worship. And then he gives them he talks to the people and he says, he said, that door is open and anyone is welcome. All of you are welcome. And he says, on those that do not like this, the door's open the other way. And these three men that had brought these concerns to him stood up, and two of them walked out, and the third one walked out in the aisle, and he looks both ways, and then he walks across the aisle and sits right down in the middle of the hippies. And he says to the preacher, okay, preacher, let's go, And I don't know, there's something about that scene that made me think, this congregation here, I feel like that would never happen here, because you guys welcome everybody, and you have love for anyone that comes in the door. And that is so encouraging to me that I don't have to worry about who comes in that door, because you guys are going to love them. You care about them. You want them to come to know the Lord. And that is the beauty of God's desire for us. The letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law says, I love you, even if you're not perfect, because I'm not perfect either. I love you because you're like me. You're seeking. You want want to know the truth. You want to know who God is and what He has for you. Welcome. Come in. I welcome all of you because I know that you, like me, are seeking to know God. And I want anyone who is seeking for the truth to come and say, give me a part of that truth. Let me have some of this instruction. Teach me your will. Teach me your desire. And God gives us just that. In Matthew 5 through 7 is called the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus has been teaching and preaching and going throughout the land, and in the process He's been healing people. He's been restoring, He's been casting out demons, and this crowd is gathering. And He sits down on the mountain, and His disciples come to Him. And as He begins to teach them, He talks about the salt and the light and how important it is. And as the crowd begins to gather around and grow, He begins to teach. And pretty soon He's probably yelling to the masses around Him about this message that He has. Love the unlovable. Care about those who are hurting. Reach out and give the life to those who want to know God, but just don't know how to get there. And He's saying, be the light, be the salt.